All right. I think it's time to go ahead and get into the main presentation. For this presentation, we have Chad Lawson from Rocket.Man. We'll be conducting an interview with Kevin White of MacJitsu, the developer of Superman, several other different titles. I think most of you at least know Kevin or have seen his name around. So we're very excited to have Kevin on this meetup. Nobody came to hear me talk, so I will go ahead and kick it over to you, gentlemen. Mic check, test. Do you guys have screen sharing or host? You got everything you need? Beautiful. I'll go ahead and stop talking now.
Thank you, Eric. Yep. Okay. I just saw Kevin's mute go off. So before I get going, Tevler, were you going to spotlight us, or am I just not seeing it the way it's going out? Aha. Cool. Um, There we go. That's what I was expecting. So if you have questions, by the way, go ahead and throw them into the chat. I've got some questions that were given to us before, as well as some I've had. But it has been several months now since we last had you here. And at that point, Superman 3 was the latest update. Now with Superman 4, first question I wanted to ask was, how does it feel to have a number of Superman releases equal to Christopher Reeve?
That if you've seen the JNUC presentations, some of the titles also match. And so hopefully I have submitted for JNUC this year. It's Superman 3, of course, which was kind of a farce, that movie. That's the one that had, although it did have Richard Pryor in it, who's fabulous, it was a weird superhero movie.
Yes.
Hopefully if I do make it to JNUC, there won't be too much slapstick involved, though. So
I thought 3 was the last of the movies, so I went and did a look a little bit before this meetup, and I had to change my joke. Didn't realize there was a fourth movie. Apparently, most people wish it never happened. So all the better there. But yeah, so as far as with Superman Quest, yeah, we got a lot of people. Most terrifying scene in any movie. We got a lot of stuff going on in the chat. With the release of Superman 4, what has been like the biggest, as this keeps going? I mean, this is just getting more and more elaborate. What was the biggest challenge in making, converting from going from 3 to 4? What has been the hardest or most satisfying part of developing this new version?
Well, there were, I mean, the difference between 3 and 4 is you can't even diff the thing. It was a complete rewrite, because at that point I decided that super, and I just usually call it super because it's easier to say, and that's also the name of the command itself, is that it needed to be sort of formalized, because prior to that it was written very much in the style of someone, or just get it done, like just make a script because we're just trying to get it done. And it kept growing and growing to the point of where it needed to have a more formal style. So that was a huge lift from 3 to 4, not just internally in the script, literally the rethinking of the name of every single feature, and formalizing the style, if you will, of how Superman was organized. So even before like the first bit of functional code happened for Super 4, it was, hey, how should this thing be organized? Not only to make more sense now, but then going forward to make it so that I can add new features without completely breaking something that's old. So that was a huge undertaking. Super 4 also introduced the idea, several, like at that point we had rapid security responses, if anybody remembers those came out. So supporting that was a big deal. And then the biggest and most satisfying break I thought of, which I can't believe I didn't think of earlier, was just simply saving the user's password to their keychain as a mechanism to cache that authentication. It's like, we have a checkbox when we connect to a server to save my password. Why don't I have a checkbox when I run software update to save my password? That's effectively what it does. And that way, the next time it asks to run software update, and assuming your password hasn't changed, you just say go, and it just goes like an Intel Mac does. And so that was a really satisfying feature it wasn't even that hard to implement. It was just like, well, why hasn't anybody thought of this yet? Like, just save my password so I don't have to keep authenticating these updates. Yeah.
I'll get to one of Richard's questions in a second because I even know the answer to that, but I'll let you. But I wanted to ask regarding that with the saving, the caching of the password. So it's still that option still involves the user typing in their password the first time, but then
That's
after that,
that's
yeah,
correct. There's not a safe way for a bash script to collect that password a la escrow buddy, because I
yeah,
know a lot of people are familiar with escrow buddy, which is basically stealing your password as you log in, but for not for nefarious purpose, but for good purpose. uh Something like that would be very cool. That, however, would require super being essentially rewritten as a binary in Swift.
yeah,
And there's all
Swift.
kinds of, because of what super does. It's kind of funny when macOS, when you run a script, you can get away with a lot of stuff that you literally don't have to ask permission for. Whereas the moment you write a binary and try to have it notarized by Apple, you literally have to ask for permission to do anything interesting. And so
Yeah,
it's not just a huge lift to take super, like, I'm just going to rewrite it. Like, that's not hard enough. It's getting it notarized by Apple would require an ungodly amount of entitlement testing and requesting, because Apple doesn't want binaries to do the kind of shenanigans that something like Super does. Um,
sure.
because it's doing stuff at the system level, and that's a security, there's the security mechanisms in place in Mac OS that make binaries not just have the ability to do stuff like that.
I'm reading things to Richard. I'm going to go ahead and address. So Richard's question that he was asking about is having with a Jamf policy script, you only have from 4 through 11.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was going to say that there's other people are responding to the fact that you can use the configuration profiles, a configuration profile to push out more because yeah, Superman addresses, let's see, what, 3 different, um, either through a Jamf policy command, through the configuration profile. You also support local plist, right? Like if I were to deploy a plist as well, how many different ways can I send parameters to Super?
So let's address the first question, which is that magic number 11. That's actually a Jamf Pro limitation. That's not a super limitation. That's a
Right.
limitation in Jamf's Pro policy mechanism that they can only, I think there's actually only 8 spaces there.
Right, because you have 1 through 3 are reserved.
Yeah, and so I spent way too much time trying to make it so that you could shove all things into one of those. But the Jamf does some weird things with parsing that you really have to have a separate key for each one of those to make it work right. At any rate, if you have more than 8 things you need to tell Super to do, I would say make a configuration profile, because at that point you're already in Jamf. So you might as well make a config profile for the things that don't change often. And that's usually what I recommend. The config profile should be considered, well, like it is on Mac OS. If you want to set a rule that someone locally can't change, you make a config profile for that. So keep in mind that if Super is deployed locally, someone could run it locally. You have to have sudo to do that, but if you want to make sort of hard rules for Super, make config profile with all those rules as hard rules, and then you only have to pass a couple things into Jamf when you run it from Jamf as a policy. But you can also just make a script that runs it, or it installs like a command line tool. Once Super's been deployed to the computer, you can treat it like a local command and just run it with 30 arguments in one big long crazy string, as long as that's not directly via Jamf Pro policy.
And something you're mentioning there, see, and this will either help clarify part of my understanding, or when I first started tinkering with Super, shortly after, not this past JNUC, but the JNUC before, at that presentation, there was, it was my understanding that when you were launching Super, like any other script from a Jamf policy, that was triggering the next, like that when I ran the sudo Jamf policy minus event super test or whatever, that would immediately trigger the next deferral pot thing to pop up. But what I didn't realize that that was handling it. That was just sending the commands. That was just setting the parameters. Super is not driven by execution like that, but rather by the launch statement. The super, what is it? It's not super launcher. What's the super dash
I
something or
think it's
other for
Super
the
Starter is what you're referring
super
to.
starter?
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's
So
correct. So I guess we should clarify. Super, although it is a script, it acts like a launch agent, which, and if you don't, or a launch daemon, if you don't know what that is, like an agent on the computer. So even when you deploy it with Jamf, for a variety of reasons, it doesn't just run the script and keep running because that would hang your Jamf policy. It needs to run repeatedly in the background. It might take 2 days to download. There's all kinds of reasons. But basically, when you execute super from Jamf in a policy, it will always install itself and then restart from the launch daemon because we need to release Jamf from waiting for super to finish. Because again, it might take hours just to download and get things going. Plus, if the user chooses to defer, the script has to stop. Otherwise, it's just going to sit there running needlessly in the background. So anytime super is deployed, if you are running super from anything that's not its normal installed location, it assumes it needs to install itself. It's like, I'm not in my normal spot. I need to install myself. And so that when you're basically running it from Jamf never waits for it to finish. That's by design.
that's so you're
Yeah,
talking about library application support Jamf waiting room or whatever it is for that, right? If that's not where it's expecting to be.
or just
So
it's actually, if it's somewhere that's not what's library
library management.
management super.
Mhm.
If you're not running it from there, it's like I'm installing myself.
Yeah, that was probably the biggest confusion for me is the amount of time I spent trying to run it as part of a Jamf policy and therefore out of library application support Jamf. And just kept seeing in the log when and it was because of one
Mhm.
of your other notes about the what does it say in the logs? And I'm like, oh, I'm an IT person. I don't look at logs. I just have to intuit myself. But
Mhm.
yeah, then starting to look at the logs, it was saying, saving itself. And I also didn't realize that then when I was doing that, it was more about creating up the modifying the P list to tell Super how to run next time. So it's like
Mhm.
all I had to do was use it. Is tell correct me if I'm wrong, but it's for those that are also possibly running into this. So when you're using a Jamf policy to deploy Super,
Mhm.
those parameters, once they're set, they're set. Um, you don't have to
Yes,
keep
correct. When
running
you
it through
hand
that.
super parameters, they will be saved like to super's property list, much like an application. So I know a lot of us, if you've used command line tools, you think of them like, oh, I run it once, and whatever those flags are, whatever those options are when I run that command, it does it once and then it never goes again. Super, again, trying to be more like an application, if you will. When you run it and you give it settings, it remembers those settings until you set something different, or you push down a config profile that then changes those settings. And to bring it back to a question you had earlier, as you mentioned, like modifying the local super property file, I wouldn't do that. I would just pass the settings into super or push down a config profile. That's the two main ways. How you run super doesn't really matter. Um, so even if you want to run from like you have a script that then runs super, that's fine too. I just wouldn't mess with the plist because super tries to manage those settings in the plist directly, to validate that yes, that really, that key really should be set for whatever it's supposed to be set for.
And I'm trying to prioritize a couple of questions that are less on topic from the chat. But one of the questions that I had seen earlier, so with um, and I'm trying to figure out how to break this into a couple of them, but there was a question about so when you're telling Super to use cache credentials. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, there are some computers like with Intel, it's all done through it doesn't care, it doesn't worry about volume owner. With Power PC, wow, did I just date myself there? With Apple Silicon, you have depending on the version, either the API model or through the command line
Mm-hmm.
approach, and that's where we need a volume owner in order to do that. If I have provided both if I have provided both the API password and a local password, which one takes priority on a computer that could do either?
That's a great question because the earlier versions of Super did allow you to have multiple stored saved credentials, starting with Super 4 just to make things more straightforward from a troubleshooting path. It only keeps one value. Whatever, if I, let's just say theoretically, I told Super, ask the user for their password and also and store that password. And then also here's some Jamf Pro API credentials. It's going to ignore the Jamf Pro API credentials.
Okay,
So
okay.
local values always take precedence over the Jamf Pro API because it's more reliable. It will always be more
Yeah.
reliable to have anything really tell software update to run locally than to tell Jamf's API to do it because it's just way more complicated because if you think about the way the local mechanism works, it's running software update local or the installer, the old the full app installers, depending on what your workflow is, and it's just calling them locally, and it can say, okay, here's the authentication, go. Versus when you call Jamf's API, you're having that Mac tell Jamf's API to eventually send the right MDM commands to tell your Mac to update. And so that's just a whole, trip around the world to do something that you could just as easily write locally. So in Super, to surmise, if you provide Super with more than one form of authentication, at local authentication always takes precedent over API authentication. Yes, thanks Tony for quoting the
Yep.
wiki.
Yep. Yeah. I was gonna say Tony's going straight for the RTFM answer. I like it.
Yeah.
Yeah. If and I so that leads to another one of my questions I wanted to ask you about. The last time we talked, you said that probably one of the biggest problems with for people using Super is that the documentation was horribly out of date or inaccurate. How do you feel that is? How good do you feel about the documentation now as a good representation of how to use it?
I think it's pretty good. I mean, I try to style it a lot. The problem with documentation is there's really two kinds of documentation. There is how you do something and there's why you do something. And why is really hard to document. Uh, because I can tell you how an individual feature works. And I try to be as concise as possible there. But why you would use a feature is always sort of difficult. That's why we have things like this or a JNUC presentation to talk about, well, why would you want to do it like that? And of course, Super has a lot of options and people want to use them all, but you don't necessarily have to. In fact, I would not recommend using them all at the same time. It will not work if you try to use every single feature at the same time, because some of them are logically incoherent when they're combined together. That being said, yeah, the documentation, that was another big push for 4.0 was to, in fact, for a while there, I literally had a completely different beta wiki to write Super 4 because it was going to completely break with Super 3. There's not backwards compatibility there because so
Oh
much
wow.
changed. And so, the version 4 wiki is pretty good. I mean, everything can be better given infinite time scale,
Yeah.
but
Are you suggesting that this is not the only thing you do all day
yeah,
long
that's
is
true.
maintain a free piece of software? Yeah. Uh-huh.
I want
Yeah,
to address that question about will Super be integrated with Swift
that's
Dialog?
exactly where I was
Yeah.
going. Yeah.
So here's the short answer: Swift Dialog doesn't support macOS 11, and Super does. There's the short answer. So if I wanted to use Swift Dialog, I'd have to drop support for macOS 11. And trust me, people, there are plenty of macOS 11 computers out there that need to be updated still. I want to keep macOS 11 as the baseline because that's sort of the beginning of time of Apple Silicon. It's the era that we're in right now. Maybe one day in the future when Mac OS 11 is, really, really old, I'll look at moving forward. But for right now, I would have to fork Super to have Swift Dialog boxes because Swift Dialog's minimum requirements are Mac OS 12.
And along those lines, has in terms of support, I know you just gave a great reason for wanting to stick with 11. If you had a tool, IBM Notifier, if IBM Notifier still supported 10.15, would you? Or is there what is your particular philosophy on which versions of the OS to change, and what has been the most frustrating? I think you've already kind of answered this, but challenge in terms of you'd like to update more, but because you're using now erase and install, right? Is in
No,
4?
no, no.
No, not
Mist
yet.
Mist
Okay.
CLI is the
Mist is,
tool
yeah.
to
Mhm.
download macOS installers if required by the workflow.
And so you've got Mist and you've got IBM Notifier as your two dependencies right now.
That's correct. Those are the only two
Yeah.
dependencies.
How have those shaped as their support requirements change? How has that changed your support desires? If that
Oh,
question makes
actually,
sense.
they're both they're both really good, straightforward, reliable tools. There was a big update to IBM Notifier late last year that made the dialogues even more robust. Like, for example, you can make it so that the dialogues in Super cannot be dismissed. You can go full screen, and all that's because of IBM Notifier. And also, just a little bit of history. At the time I started writing Super, I was trying to make it very similar to what Jamf Helper did. And the closest analogy to that at the time was IBM Notifier. Um, IBM Notifier has essentially also gotten more features. And in that meantime, of course, Swift Dialog became huge. And I don't just mean that like literally, I mean, literally, they got huge dialogues. If you want to make gigantic dialog boxes, I understand why some people might want to use Swift Dialog. Uh, but it's not only just the aforementioned limitation of Mac OS 11, it's that the way that they draw dialog boxes are very different. And it would take a lot of code rewriting to get the exact same dialogue that to work in Swift Dialog. So the same dialogues there would be a big lift. And compared to the other things I need to have free time to work on in Super, I don't think that the Swift dialogue is as important. Um, but going back to your main question about uh, dependencies, the biggest pain in the ass is just Mac OS and all its various incarnations. I mean, it's
Yeah.
just constantly I'm having to go back forth, and I'm like, that worked on 11, but then that did something different in 12. And like, what's the latest one that's like oh yeah, you can't restart the software update D process now anymore, which is just like, okay, Apple, fine. You know, I guess we won't be doing that anymore. And then also things like updates expire. And the worst case of this is those rapid security responses. They are ephemeral. They exist for like 3 weeks and then they disappear. And so, like right now, you can't even pretend to test rapid security response because they don't
Oh,
exist.
there are none. Okay.
Well, they go away as soon as the next version of macOS
Right.
comes out.
Right, because they're
So
now included into that
because
next
they're now
combo. Yeah.
included in the next version. So, I'm working on new versions of Super. I can't test against rapid security responses unless what happens to come out while I'm doing it. And based on their frequency, it kind of seems like, Apple has these hobby projects. It's like a hobby project. It didn't really work out. I don't think it was really useful. And we had like what, two ever that were live
Oh, yeah.
before the next,
I lost.
ever.
Yeah.
And so yeah, like that's the stuff that's hardest to keep up with is Mac OS shenanigans, right?
Sure. I wanted to, you've alluded to one of the other questions I want to talk to you about, but first want to address one while I'm seeing it on my screen. Emmanuel asks about when executing Super, does anything that Super, is there any part of Super's workflow that attempts to go back and point to GitHub, or is it all,
Yeah.
because he was saying that GitHub is blocked in their network. So if they're trying to use, if they can't
Mhm.
get to GitHub, is Super going to be blocked for them?
Yes, so that's a good question. So Super is just a script. It is not a binary compiled program. It doesn't even have an installer. The whole kind of initial goal, and still to this point, is it is a script. It can be deployed however you want to deploy scripts. That being said, it does, if needed, pull down Mist CLI. And that, if needed, is it calculates if it needs the Mac OS installer versus the software update. Because obviously, if you can upgrade the Mac with the local software update binary, then it doesn't need to go download Mist CLI. And so it doesn't do that. However, mandatory is the IBM Notifier, because that's what draws the dialog boxes. If you pre-install those using something like Jamf in the right location, then Super goes, cool, they're already here, moving on. So if you do have limitations to GitHub, that's fine. Just you need to pre-install those. You can technically also put them anywhere you want. You would just have to go into the superscript and then tell Super that it should find them somewhere else. In the parameters section of the superscript, there's a path for where it expects to see missed CLI and a path for where it expects to see IBM Notifier. And if you just pre-install those, again, wherever you want, then you can just go and either change those paths in Super, or you can pre-install them in the Super folder as normal.
Excellent. Oh, and then okay, so that then leads to that. So when you're saying pre-install them, you would put them in Super. It's not like you would put them in some other library application support, for your own local organization,
If
and
you
then like
want to do
modify the
that,
path. You could do it, but
yeah, you
But
can do
by
that. You can
default.
either put it where Super already, because if you look again, that's the beauty of it's a script. It's a script. Go change the path.
Yeah.
There are 2 lines in Super that are the paths to those dependencies in the Super folder. If you don't like those paths, change them in the script, and we can use the copy of IBM Notifier wherever you put it. Because if as long as there's a copy locally on the computer of the dependencies, Super won't try to go get them again.
Okay. And if the dependency was missing and required, so like it needs mist in order to determine what version to go with, mist is not present, and it therefore fails, the way to gather to identify that would be through the logs. That's clearly in your super log.
Yeah, that's correct. Most of Super writes logs to the operating system because that's where you were to do such a thing. Because again, Super is a background process, so it can't write logs back to Jamf all the time. Although upon installation, if Jamf is trying to install Super and it can't pull down those dependencies, that failure will make it back to the Jamf policy, and the Jamf policy will show as failed. So during installation, any failures do make it back to your Jamf server, and then you'll know if it failed or not. Going forward, let's say you ran Super again, and all of a sudden something wasn't there, or a new version needs to come out, or whatever. Then Super will attempt to go out to GitHub to find those if it can't. And if that fails, then Super goes, well, I can't do anything now. I guess I'll try again later.
Okay, but it was noted in the log, and so if you had an
Absolutely,
extension attribute in Jamf, you could be looking for potential problems like that if it was.
Yeah, and actually, because it's difficult to see the Super logs, there are a couple of extension attributes. One specifically shows the Super status. So when Super does sort of key things or exits, definitely when it exits, it'll write the last thing it was trying to do to the P list in the Super status key. And there is an extension attribute for Jamf that's just, hey, collect that status to let me know what Super's doing right now or what state it's in. So, for example, if the user clicked defer and it's not going to start up again for another day and a half, the Super status will be like deferred per user till this time. And I'll let you know I'm not going to start up again till later.
So that's in the P list as well. So it defaults read could grab that just as easily as.
Like I said, there's already if you look in the Super Friends folder,
I love that
in
folder,
the GitHub, in the GitHub, there is an EA called Super Status, and that'll grab that. Just write, you don't even have to write that. The EA already exists for that.
Yeah, I was sad that none of the Super Friends were named something like you didn't have Batman and I was trying to think of the Wonder Twins and I could not come up with their names.
Oh, no.
Go down that rabbit hole of naming things. It was reminded of because you've got Superman, just Super for short, but I remember that in one of Graham's presentations about the failing on his part of naming it erase install and look at that, somebody's already beat me to what the twins names were, but by naming it erase install, that became locked into its name, even though it does way more than erasing and installing now. So you got ahead of that by giving it a name that gave you more fluidity in what it does.
More runway, yeah. Well, also it was originally conceived as a project for a customer who likes acronyms. So that's why it's spelled like that. It is an acronym. And so the acronym then became, look, I'm not going to type Superman every time I want to run this in the command line. So it just became
Yeah.
super.
But you had already alluded to, let's see, all right, I'll come to that question in a second. Somebody posted something in the Q&A, so it became a lot easier to track. But you already alluded to the next version. So, and other than the fact that it will take you out of the Christopher Reeve movie thread for your puns, what is on the horizon for the next version of Superman? What challenges have you been facing that you think, or are you at a spot where you're like, now it's a matter of maintenance, or is there a new set of challenges ahead that you want to be able to conquer?
So the big push to 4 was to formalize it. So for the next, I don't know, little bit, whatever you want to call it, so it's going to be versions of 4 because I really, the change from 3 to 4 was significant because I wanted to make future versions append logically to the naming structure and the feature structure of Super version 4. So 4.1 is in development right now. And the big thing that I'm trying to accomplish with it is the handling of deferrals and scheduled events in a more formal manner. Right now, Super's concept of day 0 is when it discovered that an update has happened. But that might not have any bearing on when it actually came out. Or it also, as it turns out, Apple's deferral mechanism isn't quite reliable. And that deferral config profile will sometimes say that things are available when they're really not, or vice versa. And then I'm basically having to re-architect how Super discovers things because the current method isn't reliable enough. And as it turns out, starting with 12.3, things got really weird with software update. You can, for example, everybody knows that the macOS installers can run upgrades. That's what we've had for years. Then Apple introduced what they call an over-the-air update, which really just means that software update is doing an upgrade as if it was just a minor update. So to clarify, prior to 12.3, the only way to upgrade was to run the installer, right? With 12.3 and later, Apple introduced what they called over-the-air upgrades. It's a terrible name for what is essentially software update has the ability to both update you to a minor version or upgrade you to a major version. That's cool, except for all the times when it can't do that. Because, for example, if you're running 12.3 and you're calling it via MDM, it still calls the installer, even though it can do it locally via the over-the-air method. Oh, and when macOS 14 came out, the over-the-air method in macOS 12 lost the ability to do 13. So if you run software update on macOS 12.3, it shows you macOS 12.7 and then macOS 14. There is no macOS 13. It's like all these weird things that you can't predict Apple's going to do to you until like time has passed. And so I'm having to rewrite the thing that can discover upgrades and updates to make sure that it does the right thing every time based on the variables. Am I using the API? Am I doing it locally? What's available? Because a big feature of Super is the ability to say, I only want Super to keep this computer on macOS 13. I don't want it to ever go, or if I'm doing upgrades, maybe I want to go to 13, but I don't want to go to 14 yet. And so in order to accommodate all those different workflows, the logic for what update should I do right now is really complicated. Yeah. Add on top of that the fact that we have this deferral config profile now, or we've had it for a while, the ability to look at that and accurately tell you, because that's one of the things is you can push down a deferral config profile and you kind of don't know when it's going to become available to the end user. Like there's nothing in the OS that tells you, at least historically, that could tell you that. Now Super's going to have that ability. And then also we have to thank our friends at Mac Admins for a new thing called SOFA, which just hit recently. That is very interesting. And that is also something I'm looking at. If you don't know, SOFA is what does it stand for? Something software.
Hang on. Simple, organized feed for Apple software updates.
Thank you. Yes.
Well, no, thank you to Joseph English, who put a
Yes.
question in the thread about that answered that for you.
Yeah. And that was not a lead into that question. Like literally it came out. I'm like, oh, this is finally something I need. Because historically, which is crazy, Apple has not had a feed that is a rational, normal thing to look at to determine when something came out. And so that is out as well too. And so all this is basically winding up to the big thing in 4.1 is going to be the foundation for even better scheduling of updates, because Super will have definitive knowledge about when something came out and when, and then you can do like hard deadlines or hard schedules for basically if you want to do all the fancy scheduling stuff that everybody keeps asking, like, hey, can I do it on a Tuesday after the update comes out, or like these sort of like fuzzy logic things. None of that is possible in Super 4 because it literally doesn't know what the true date of when something came out was. And so with 4.1, that's another big push, is giving me the foundation so that in the future, if we want to do features where I'm scheduling things, not just sort of reacting and saying so many days, I need to have that baseline of, hey, when did this thing actually come out? And so that's really what I'm working on next. Obviously in bug fixes, always bug fixes.
I'm trying to figure out, I want to get through a number of these questions in here. One, I'm not sure we would potentially, I'm going to go ahead and read it and see if there's an easy answer to it.
Okay.
Are you in the Q&A Dropbox as well?
No, I'm just looking at the chat.
Okay, there's one in the Q&A box that says, asking about they're using zero dates and hard deadlines to enforce updates. Encountering an issue, which appears to be the same thing as a particular bug about sus no GUI users currently logged in. If you can see, I did not mean to put the
I'm
little
reading it
point
right
up.
now. I
No.
found it. Okay.
Okay, you found it. Then I'll stop reading.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, there's not so the symptom is the user reboots the computer, and before the system basically goes ahead and runs the install. I wonder if that's due to the way that, so yeah, when you're calling, I believe the issue is actually, so Super caches the installs, and that's actually the incorrect term for what actually is happening. It tells the installers to prepare themselves so that when the user does click go or the MDM command comes down, it's ready to go. It literally can fire off almost immediately. There are some cases where if that has happened, and then the MDM commands are also coming in to say, check on this, that the computer can go, oh, I'm restarting and I have this upgrade or update cache. I'm just going to friggin' do it. And it just happens. I think that's what this person's experiencing. I don't know. Yeah, this says the computer restarts once more and the OS update installs. Yeah, the problem is that if an update is cached and the OS has been told it's okay to do it eventually, the next reboot it'll just do it. Even if we don't say do it, it'll do it. So I don't know that I'm going to be able to specifically fix that bug. Yeah. So I don't know that that has anything specifically to do with how Super, well, it does have to do with how Super is caching the update, but I don't think I can make it so that the computer doesn't try to do the update. So as far as the 4.1 release, betas are going to be really soon here. Again, I'm rewriting a large part of it to make it work with this new scheduling feature set. And so 4.1 betas will be out very, very soon.
Let's see. Wow, we've got on where to learn more about. I want to quickly address, see what answers you have for this. And I don't want to get too far away from.
Actually,
from
I have a really good one in there that I want to talk about.
Oh, please.
Any future plans to introduce specific macOS updates versions? So not upgrade versions, updates. Here's the problem. Feedback.apple.com. Apple expires updates. So if software update doesn't see that old version, I can't target it anymore. For instance, if you run software update right now on any Mac that needs updates, you're going to see only two versions of macOS at most, unupgrade and unupdate. That is it. and it's going to pick those versions based on, well, it's going to be the latest versions, unless you have a deferral config profile in there, and then it will be backed out versions. So Super literally can't tell software update to go get an older version of a minor update. It can't do it. You have to use the configuration profile, specifically the macOS restrictions config profile that has a number of days deferred. That is the only mechanism on Earth that can make the software update process not present you with the latest version of a minor update. So even if I wanted to do that, I can't. I literally can't do it. It's not that I don't want to do it. It's you can't, because software update only presents you with the whatever version it thinks you should be allowed to have based on your deferrals. You cannot specify an old version.
Keeping an eye on time, but yeah, we've obviously got a lot more questions we weren't able to get to, which may or may not mean we need to have you back in a little bit, depending on how far away 5 is. But either closer to Mac admins or something, if you're available, we'll probably have to bring you back for some more questions. Anything else you wanted to specifically make sure that you had a chance to talk about, or should I get ready to hand back off to our host?
No, I really appreciate all the folks that are in the Mac. I want to talk about the Mac Admin Slack. I am not there that often anymore because I'm busy either working on Super or other things. So I just want to give a shout out to all the folks that are on the Mac Admin Slack Super channel that help out. I really appreciate what you folks do. I was, initially I started the channel and I was on there a lot because there was nobody else that knew how it worked. And I had to spend a lot of time. I spent a lot of time that I could have been doing other things, just responding. And I haven't been able to use that time. But the great thing is there's enough of a community there of other smart folks using Super that have the experience, in some cases even more experience than I do, because they literally have thousands of runs across their organization of Super running. Whereas, I've got my test fleet of like one Mac and a bunch of VMs. And so I really appreciate the folks that are in the Super Slack channel helping out, because I just don't have the cycles to be in there as much as I want to.
Yeah. Well, I will echo what I see going on in the chat and so forth is, yeah, many thanks to you for your time and dedication. Super has definitely shaved off many hours, and somebody asked earlier about the hair color and matching the room. One did not follow the other, but yeah, if it weren't for the blue, you'd see a lot more gray that comes from maintaining updating machines, and Super has definitely been an incredible tool in making that. I won't say easy, but definitely much easier. So, all right. Thank you very much, Kevin. With that, I will hand back to Eric.
Thank you, Chad. Thank you, Kevin. Sorry, I'm looking at removing the spotlight here. Oh, thank you for whoever helped me with that. Yeah, I think it was a fitting way for you guys to end talking about the community. I think that's what this all boils down to is there's an amazing Jamf admin community. I know it was really cool to see in the chat people expressing a lot of gratitude for what you've done with Super. So Kevin, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us here, and also for developing these tools that you've done. In speaking about the community, I think because we do have some time left, we would be remiss if we didn't mention Charles Edge, somebody that was an absolute pillar of this community. And so with that, I want to give Chris Shazi a chance to speak.
Hey guys. Yeah, not an easy thing to talk about. Definitely, if you hadn't heard the news, Charles Edge tragically and very surprisingly passed away. I don't know if that was a week ago or a couple weeks ago. And it kind of just seems unreal to a lot of us in the community. I know I didn't know Charles Edge as well as many people here. But for the little bit I knew him working at Jamf, seeing him at conferences afterwards, getting consulting advice from him about my business, huge influence on me in ways I don't even think I understood until I heard the news. But what a person he not only like, I mean, he made some incredible documentation, wrote many books, just did so many things that seemed, you know, in a way almost superhuman. Um, it's just, yeah, an incredible person. And on top of that, I think the thing that always struck me about him is just with all the things he did, always having a smile on his face, never seemed stressed out, always seemed carefree. And that's always been an inspiration for me is like, we try to do this Mac admin type stuff, trying to run a company. It's very stressful. And someone who was so successful in this area just seemed like he never had that level of stress. I don't know. There's not much to say. It's crazy. It's sad. Sometimes I don't know how to process things, but yeah, he definitely was taken too soon, but what a life he lived.
Thanks, Chris. I think that was well said. And we had Charles on our presentation, I think 3 months ago. So it's just crazy to hear and process there. With that said, though, Charles, and this presentation is a testament to what a great community we have. So with that, we are at our time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to Kevin, especially, for giving us his time. Chad, you did a great job hosting as well. And thanks for everyone for joining us. We will get out the invites to next month's Jamf admin meetup soon. Hopefully we see you all there. In the meantime, everyone have a great weekend. If you have any Jamf related questions or you're looking for any Jamf insights, feel free to reach out to us at Rocket.Man. That is what we do. Happy to work with any and all of you. But again, thank you guys so much for joining. Thanks for making this community what it is. I appreciate it.